Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to talk about something many have felt, but few truly understand: the silence after a breakup. A man may walk away, he might post pictures, laugh louder, or even date someone new. He might convince the world and sometimes himself that he's over you. But there's one thing he can't fake: the weight of silence. Silence is more revealing than actions or words. It is the quiet space between conversations that often holds the loudest truths. While words can be chosen, rehearsed, or even manipulated to craft an image, silence cannot be edited. It is raw. It is honest. It doesn't perform for anyone. And that's exactly why it exposes the real emotional landscape someone might be trying to hide. In the aftermath of a breakup, it's common to see people put on a brave face. Social media is filled with smiles, filtered photos, and new beginnings. The world has shown a version of them that appears healed, detached, and perhaps even indifferent. But what many forget is that actions can be staged. A man can go out, date someone else, laugh in public, and carry on with life as though nothing ever touched him deeply. He might not even say your name again, but if you really want to understand what he's feeling, look at the silence that follows the space where there's no performance. Silence has a way of creeping in during the in-between moments. It's not in the loud celebrations or the crowded rooms, it's in the car rides alone, the nights when sleep doesn't come easy, the quiet mornings when the world is still waking up. That's when the mask falls away. In those moments, the mind is left to wander, and it often wanders right back to what he tries so hard to forget. Memories resurface uninvited, regrets echo louder, and the person he claims to have moved on from becomes present in the absence of noise. There's a reason people fear silence. It forces them to confront things they'd rather avoid. A man who truly feels nothing doesn't need silence to speak for him. He's moved on, emotionally and mentally. But the man who sits quietly and doesn't reach out, yet doesn't seem settled, is often the one still carrying emotional weight. He may not call, he may not text, but it's not always because he doesn't care. Sometimes silence is a form of protection, not from you, but from himself. He knows that if he opens that door again, even slightly, everything he has been suppressing will flood back. And he's not ready to deal with that. Silence is not emptiness, it's not absence. In fact, silence is often filled with meaning, tension, and emotional residue. It says, "I'm still thinking," when words would rather say, "I've forgotten." It says, "I miss you," in a way that pride won't allow aloud. It's in the message not sent, the number not dialed, the photo not liked. These non-actions are louder than any direct communication because they reveal a tug of war within the heart, the desire to stay distant and the pull to reconnect. And perhaps most painfully, silence is the space where what could have been lives, every version of what if, every unsaid apology, every hope for one more chance, they all echo in silence. That's why when you sit quietly yourself, you might feel him there too, even if he hasn't spoken to you in weeks or months. Because silence between two people who once mattered to each other is never just silence. It's a message without words. It's everything that couldn't be said, still finding a way to speak. So while the world looks for closure in actions or declarations, the truth often hides in what isn't said at all. And in that silence, if you listen closely, the heart finally tells the truth. Distractions can fake healing, but quiet moments reveal truth. In a world that never stops moving, it's easy to believe that keeping busy is the same as moving on. After a breakup, many people dive headfirst into noise, new hobbies, social outings, work, or even rebound relationships. It looks like progress, and sometimes it even feels like it. There's a sense of purpose, momentum, and emotional distance. But often, this is a carefully constructed illusion. It's not real healing, it's escape. Distractions provide temporary relief. They fill the space where pain lives and give the illusion that everything is under control. A man who appears to be doing fine might be out every weekend, posting with friends, picking up new interests, and smiling through it all. To the outside world, he's thriving. He looks like someone who has let go. But healing doesn't always happen in public. Sometimes the strongest signs of attachment are the ones hidden behind the busiest schedule. The truth is, it's much easier to stay in motion than to sit still. Because when everything stops, when the music fades, the friends go home, and the phone goes silent, that's when reality arrives. That's when the emotions he thought he'd outrun show up at his doorstep. It's in those quiet moments when the heart begins to whisper what the mind has tried to silence. The pain he covered with distractions rises to the surface. The memories he buried start to replay, and the truth becomes harder to ignore. You see, distractions are a buffer. They act as a shield between him and the raw vulnerability that comes with true emotional processing. They keep the focus outward, never allowing too much time to reflect inward. That's why some people never stop moving, because stopping means facing everything they've been running from. It means feeling the aches they've avoided. It means accepting that despite all the outward signs of strength, the wound is still open beneath the surface. It's in the quiet, empty rooms where the truth speaks the loudest. Alone, without validation or attention, without anything to prove or anyone to impress, he meets himself just as he is. And if he hasn't truly healed, that meeting isn't easy. That's when he realizes that the pain is still there, that he still thinks about the moments, the laughter, the connection. that he still replays the words he said or didn't say. It's in that stillness that his emotional attachment reveals itself because there's nothing left to cover it. Even the strongest distractions begin to wear thin over time. They lose their power to numb, and slowly, the truth begins to push through the cracks. That's why someone who appears fine for weeks or months can suddenly spiral. The distractions stop working. The truth can no longer be denied. The silence that once felt avoidable becomes impossible to ignore. And in that silence, his emotional reality finally takes shape. Healing doesn't happen in the rush, it happens in the stillness, in the quiet acknowledgement of pain, in the reflection that comes when there's nothing left to hide behind. Distractions may delay the process, but they can't replace it. Eventually, every person must face themselves in those quiet moments. And when they do, the truth that was always there finally finds its voice. Ignoring communication can signal unresolved feelings. On the surface, silence might seem like indifference. When someone doesn't reply, doesn't call, or chooses not to acknowledge a message, it's easy to assume they simply don't care. But beneath that silence, there is often more happening than what appears. Ignoring someone can be an intentional act not to hurt or dismiss, but to protect oneself from emotions that haven't been fully processed. In many cases, avoiding communication is not about the absence of feeling, but the presence of too much. When a person still has emotional ties, hearing from someone they were once close to can be overwhelming. A message might stir up memories, regrets, or desires that they've been trying hard to suppress. Responding means engaging. It means possibly reopening a wound or facing a truth that they're not yet ready to deal with. Ignoring is easier. It creates distance. It helps them maintain control over emotions that feel too big to manage. People often underestimate how difficult it can be to talk to someone you haven't moved on from. When feelings linger beneath the surface, even a simple "how are you" can become emotionally loaded. It's not just a question. It's a reminder of what was shared, of what was lost, of what might still exist. Responding might lead to vulnerability. And vulnerability might lead to exposure, to admitting that the healing isn't finished, that the feelings haven't faded. In many cases, someone avoids communication not because they don't care, but because they care too much. They don't trust themselves to keep their emotions contained if they open the door even a little. They fear that once the conversation starts, all the progress they think they've made will unravel. So they shut it down before it begins. They ignore the message. They stay silent. But that silence often speaks more loudly than words ever could. It's also important to consider the emotional complexity behind avoidance. Sometimes unresolved guilt or regret can make communication feel impossible. A person might avoid you not because they hold resentment, but because they're ashamed. They might feel they failed you, hurt you, or didn't do enough. That shame becomes a barrier. Reaching out would mean facing themselves, their choices, their mistakes, and that's something not everyone is prepared to do. Ignoring communication can also be a form of emotional defense. If they believe reconnecting might bring pain or confusion, staying silent feels like the safer option. They might still think about you. They might still care deeply. But in their mind, responding risks opening a door that should stay closed. They assume that avoiding communication is the way to keep the peace, even if that peace is a fragile illusion. This doesn't mean that silence should always be romanticized or misinterpreted. Sometimes people do walk away with clarity and certainty, but when someone who once cared deeply chooses to ignore rather than engage, it's often not as simple as detachment. It may reflect an inner conflict, a heart still holding on, a mind trying to let go, and a silence caught somewhere in between. Emotional avoidance is complex. It's not always logical, and it's rarely easy. When someone chooses not to respond, it may be their way of coping with feelings that are too raw, too unresolved, or too painful to confront. So while words may be absent, the meaning behind the silence might be more revealing than anything that could be said out loud. Ignoring communication doesn't always mean a closed heart. Sometimes it means that the heart is still struggling to make peace with what it feels. Emotional attachment doesn't disappear with the end of a relationship. It doesn't dissolve simply because two people decide to part ways. Love, connection, and shared memories don't operate on the same timeline as breakups. While a relationship might end with a conversation, a decision, or even silence, the emotional ties built over time often linger long after the final goodbye. It's not about weakness or inability to move on. It's about the reality of how deeply we connect with others and how long it truly takes to untangle those bonds. When people share their lives, days, dreams, secrets, and routines, they form an emotional rhythm together. That rhythm doesn't stop the moment the relationship ends. There's an invisible presence that remains in songs, in places, in conversations with mutual friends, and in the way certain memories surface unexpectedly. The heart doesn't know how to unlove on command. You can know a relationship isn't right. You can walk away for the right reasons, but the emotional residue stays. It follows you into new experiences, showing up quietly in the background, sometimes when you least expect it. Some people assume that moving on is a sign of strength, while lingering emotions are signs of weakness. But that's not the case. Emotional attachment is not weakness, it's a reflection of depth. It means you were present, invested, real. If you've built something genuine, It's only natural for your emotions to outlive the structure of the relationship itself. Feelings don't follow logic. They don't take instructions from final texts or changed relationship statuses. They continue until they've fully run their course, and that process is rarely clean or quick. It's also why people can feel waves of sadness or longing months after the breakup, even if they were the one who initiated it. Emotional attachment doesn't care about who left first. It doesn't disappear just because you no longer speak. In fact, the absence of contact can often intensify the emotions. The mind begins to reflect more deeply when space and silence take over. Suddenly, the smallest memories feel sharper. Regret might grow louder. Questions that were once buried resurface. Did I do the right thing? Could it have worked out differently? These thoughts don't come from nowhere. They come from emotional threads still holding on. Even new relationships don't always erase those attachments. Someone might enter a new chapter of their life, smiling with a new partner, appearing healed. But somewhere within, there might still be moments where the past quietly knocks. Not because they're not happy now, but because what was shared still meant something. Emotional attachment doesn't mean you want the person back. It just means a part of your heart still remembers. Time helps, of course. With time, intensity fades. The memories become less sharp. The emotional weight becomes lighter. But none of this happens instantly. The end of a relationship is not a switch, it's a process. And emotional attachment is the last part to let go. It lingers through the healing, through the growth, and through the silence. Eventually, it softens into something manageable, something you carry without pain. But getting there takes honesty, patience, and compassion for yourself. So when someone seems fine after a breakup, when they say they're over it but flinch at reminders, understand that they're likely still navigating emotional threads. Because while the relationship may have ended, the heart often needs time to catch up with the mind. Emotional attachment lingers not as a flaw, but as proof that love, once real, leaves echoes behind. The heart speaks clearest in silence. When the noise fades, when the distractions fall away, and when the world is quiet, that's when the truth finally emerges. It's not always in the words spoken or the actions taken that we understand our deepest emotions. Often it's in those still moments, in the spaces where nothing is said, that the heart begins to whisper its clearest truths. Silence has a way of stripping away all the layers we build to protect ourselves. It reveals the emotions we've been avoiding, the feelings we didn't want to admit, and the connections we tried to bury. After a breakup or emotional distance, people often seek clarity. They look for signs in texts, gestures, or social media posts. But the loudest revelations don't always come from outward expressions. They come when someone sits alone with their thoughts. When they're no longer performing for others or pretending for themselves. In those moments, the heart speaks freely, without filters, without pride, without fear. You can ignore your feelings all day, stay busy, laugh with friends, move through routines. But when you're alone at night, when the noise finally dies down, there's no more hiding. That's when the ache shows up. That's when memories replay. That's when you realize you're not as young, as detached as you thought. The silence doesn't just bring stillness, it brings truth. It brings you face to face with emotions you've been pushing away: longing, regret, love, confusion. People often say they're fine. They say they've moved on. But if you watch closely, silence will tell you what their words won't. The person who pauses before answering, the one who looks away at certain memories, or the one who chooses not to speak at all, those moments of silence are not empty. They're full of what the heart is too afraid or too unsure to say out loud. Silence becomes the voice of unresolved feelings. Sometimes we don't respond to a message not because we don't care, but because we care too much. We fear what opening that door might do. So instead we stay quiet, but even in that quiet, our heart is speaking. Saying, I'm still processing, or I'm not ready. It might be saying, I miss you, in a way that words never could. Silence is powerful because it carries all the emotion we haven't yet put into language. And that emotion often says more than 1,000 well-chosen sentences ever could. The heart doesn't need words to communicate. It uses silence, glances, distance, timing. And ironically, when someone says nothing, that's sometimes when they're feeling the most. We grow up thinking communication is all about speaking, but in reality, listening to what's not being said is just as important. Because in that space between messages, between conversations, the heart has its own way of expressing itself. In silence, there are questions unanswered, hopes unspoken, and love that hasn't quite left. It's not always comfortable to sit in silence with yourself or with someone else, but it's honest. There's no room for pretending. That's why it's so revealing. When someone you once loved goes silent, you can often feel more from that stillness than from anything they might have said. It's in the quiet where we find what matters. The noise can distract, words can lie. But the heart, when left alone in silence, tells the truth every time. You just have to be still enough and brave enough to hear it. Listening to silence is key to understanding emotional truth. We often focus so much on what people say that we overlook what they don't, yet silence can speak volumes. It holds emotion, meaning, and intention. In many situations, especially after a relationship ends or when emotional tension rises, it's the absence of words that reveals the most. Silence is not just an empty space, it's a container for everything that feels too complicated, too painful, or too vulnerable to be said aloud. It is where unspoken truths quietly wait to be felt if we are willing to listen closely. People use silence in many ways. Sometimes it's used to protect feelings, to process overwhelming emotions, or to avoid saying something that might make things worse. Other times, it's a way of holding back truth, a form of emotional self-preservation. And while we might be quick to assume that someone's silence means they've moved on, or that they no longer care, the reality is often more layered. Silence can be a wall, but it can also be a window. It can hide and it can reveal. It depends on how we listen. Listening to silence requires patience. It asks us to stop projecting our assumptions and start paying attention to the emotional energy behind it. Is the silence heavy? Is it cold and closed off? Or does it carry the weight of something left unresolved? Silence can feel like avoidance, but sometimes it's grief in disguise. It can feel like indifference, but it might actually be a sign of someone who is still hurting and unsure how to say it. To truly listen to silence, you have to tune in to more than words. You have to feel the presence within the absence. In relationships, especially during conflict or after a breakup, silence often replaces dialogue. One person may withdraw, not because they have nothing to say, but because they are overwhelmed with too much to say. They may be afraid that speaking will unravel their carefully built emotional walls. They may worry that if they express their truth, they'll fall back into something they're trying to leave behind. So they stay silent, hoping the feelings will pass. But inside, their silence is filled with thought, memory, longing, regret, and confusion. Listening to that silence means recognizing that what's not said can hurt just as much as what is. Silence also shows up when someone is thinking deeply. They may not respond right away, not because they are ignoring you, but because they are reflecting. They are searching for the right words or maybe struggling to find any words at all. In those cases, silence is not a dismissal, it's a sign of internal movement. Listening then becomes an act of empathy, of reading between the lines, of sensing the truth beneath the quiet. It's about honoring that space instead of rushing to fill it. Many of us are uncomfortable with silence. We want answers, reactions, closure, but emotional truth doesn't always come packaged in perfect explanations. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a long pause, an unsent message, or a look that says more than language ever could. To listen to silence is to accept that not everything needs to be spelled out to be understood. The truth is often subtle, fragile, and easily missed if we're not paying close enough attention. In the end, silence is part of emotional expression, not separate from it. When someone goes quiet, it's not always the end of the story, it might be the most honest part. Listening to that silence with awareness and sensitivity allows us to uncover emotional realities that words alone might never reveal.